Nowhere to hide. We're going to talk a little bit about media bias today, but maybe not in the sense that you've heard me talk about media bias in the past. I want to talk about controlling your mind and not so much how the media is trying to control your mind as much as the need for you to control your mind so somebody else doesn't try to. I'll tell you more in just a moment.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. And my goal is not to convince you that you are brainwashed so much as to recognize the fact that we're all brainwashed to some degree. And it's not a matter of, well, I'm smarter than that. We all feel like we are too smart to be misled. Nobody likes to be capable of being duped. But the bottom line is, if you're not very much actively formulating your own opinions and doing your own research and thinking things through for yourself, it's a lot easier to be misled than you might think. So as I mentioned before, the idea is either you control your mind or someone else will. This is a saying associated to John Alston. And I want to give you a couple of examples of what this looks like, starting with, I know it's election season, so we see a whole lot of this going on, the political ads. There's so many misleading things. Well, it's plausibly true. And someone who's, very skilled in sophistry will try to convince us that this is really truth when it isn't. But let me show you a couple of ways that we've been fooled in the past, and then we can use those as ways to fortify ourselves against attempts like that in the future. So first off, when you hear people talk about, look, I am too smart to do this, believe it or not, the people who tend to fall for propaganda and tend to fall for the bias that is being projected at them tend to be pretty smart people. Number one, they have bigger egos, right? I'm intelligent. I'm way too smart for this. Nobody could ever fool me. And that, unfortunately, is a weakness that allows them to be manipulated. Brainwashed has nothing to do with your IQ. I actually like the way Elgato Malo is the one who made this observation here. I wonder if there might be correlation. Smart people seem more able to convince themselves of outlandish convolutions. But this is the one that really drives it home. Nothing runs off the track faster than a thoroughbred. Don't want to brag too much there, do we? Now, this brings us to the question. So let's look back, for instance, at some of the things that happened over the course of the last few years, particularly regarding COVID. Dr. Jay Bhattacharya, one of the signatories to the Great Barrington Declaration, asks, are there really people who believe the Biden government censors the internet in order to shelter people from falsehood rather than to hide criticism of its lies and suppress dissent? They censored the very idea of immunity when it cut against their policy objectives. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pick the scab off a wound that a lot of people wish would be just healed over and gone away. But we need to remember how we were lied to and how we were deceived, particularly relating to COVID. So this is a list of a lot of the dissenting opinions that were suppressed and ridiculed at the time that have since proven to be correct. And by the way, Bill Maher, I know, to appeal to Bill Maher, he was actually, if it's so obvious that he can talk about this safely on his program, you better believe it's getting pretty obvious. And this includes dissenting opinions like COVID came from a lab, ivermectin worked, masks offered no benefit and were actually harmful, they should never have kept kids out of school, natural immunity is better than vaccinated immunity, long COVID is often a symptom of long vaccination, hospitals murdered COVID patients. Now, that sounds pretty inflammatory, but through the protocols that they used, people died who didn't have to. So I'm not necessarily thinking you should shy away from the word murdered. That rigid, well, this is our policy and this is what we have to do, ended up killing a lot of people who otherwise might have survived. COVID fatality rate and death count were highly inflated. Unvaccinated were scapegoated for the failure of the shots. Early treatment was suppressed to make way for a vaccine. This means things like ivermectin. Risks of the jab were intentionally hidden from the public. Vaccine mandates are wrong. Here's a couple more opinions. More shots equal more risk of infection. COVID shots are neither safe nor effective. Now, again, these are all opinions that were suppressed and ridiculed and would get your content removed on various social media platforms at the insistence of the U.S. government or the Centers for Disease Control or others who wanted to control the narrative. And yet every single one of these dissenting opinions has proven to be correct. Oh, I know there are still some dead enders out there like Saddam Hussein's last true believers. Oh, there's nobody invading Baghdad and we're going to still come back and seize control. No, that ship has sailed. And it's probably a good thing that it has. Now, as far as the ivermectin thing, this is the part that just absolutely blows me away. And I got to tip my hat to Dominic Scarcella for pointing this out to me. He quotes Dr. Pierre Corey. The most troubling aspect of this wickedly positive ivermectin trial, which was just recently released, or published rather, is that it was completed on June 15th, 2021. They finally get it published almost 3 full years later. What did this trial show? It actually showed that it helps. How many times have you heard, it's horse goo and you shouldn't take that. You're stupid if you're eating veterinary stuff that was meant for horses. And yet ivermectin, according to this study, worked. Dr. Corey says the medical journal editorial mafia is alive and well, apparently. I can bet that several journals sat on it for that period of time. Dominic Scarcella comes right to the point, says, well, what Dr. Corey calls the medical journal edition mafia looks like another example of a blank industrial complex, in this case, the medical industrial complex. By the way, did you realize that there were, healthcare organizations that were getting pretty decent spiffs and incentives for every person they could get to agree to take the vaccine? Yeah, it's perverse incentives will sometimes bring perverse results. This is why the COVID numbers were so inflated, including deaths and so forth. If you could tell somebody, well, this person died of COVID or died with COVID, but somehow COVID was on their birth certificate or their death certificate, rather, that meant that the government would, throw a few shekels your way. Ugly, ugly stuff. And again, it was done to protect a particular narrative, and even more so, I think, to protect, the pharmaceutical industry. Don't believe me? Why don't you flip on the evening news and watch it for a few minutes? How far do you have to go before a pharmaceutical company commercial comes on? It ain't very long. I know this because every time I go to visit my mom, when the news comes on, that's all I see is drug company ads. Crazy stuff. You don't think that would have any influence, right? We wouldn't want that cash cow that's giving us all this advertising revenue to go away. Now, El Gato Malo weighed in on this and says, yes, I suspect that there are many people who believe the government censors are fighting disinformation. And this is the predictable outcome of having spent so long in echo chambers and one-sided debates on slanted playing fields where only one side is permitted to speak, that fairness and open discourse feels like bias. And trust the experts is substituted for, maybe try using your own brain for a minute. Because do your own work has been so effectively vilified as some sort of Luddite anti-science practice, as opposed to the actual foundational basis for the scientific method and the Enlightenment. He's not wrong, by the way. And if you spend a few minutes on X, you will find many video collections of people who are saying exactly that. This trust the science. How could you possibly? We trust the science. Trust the science. The science was wrong because it was corrupted. It was co-opted. El Gato Malo says, even once August institutions like MIT and the Ivies lined up on teams, science is an institution, not a practice. And the irony is that this is a LOI cult of self-deluding, useful idiots calling everyone else unenlightened, and anti-science really gets quite thick. But El Gato Malo says, I imagine once one settles in, it's quite a snug little worldview, safe in its self-justifying logical recursion. Place your trust in narrative and you're always the good guy. No more worries. It's a form of informational soma. By the way, if you haven't read Brave New World, dust off your Aldous Huxley and you'll find it probably reads a little different after what we've been through. El Gato Malo says, this is why they saturation bomb airwaves and media with these messages and make them so simple, so stark, and so carefully framed in us versus them. At a certain point, it becomes a tribal affinity that groups actually fight to protect. And the longer you do it, the more invested you become and the harder it is to stop. So let me give you a little example of what that might look like. The January 6th narrative, for instance. This is a commentary from James Howard Kunstler. And boy, he pulls no punches. He says, the miasma of anxiety befogging so many brains in our troubled land begins to lift as every narrative served up by the U.S. fascist intel blob goes annoyingly stale and impotent. The worst media meme that a vicious officialdom is defending our democracy gets laughed out of the room now when repeated incessantly by such shills as Jen Psaki and Lawrence O'Donnell of MSNBC. Everybody understands they want to defend our democracy by canceling your freedom of speech, pounding you into bankruptcy, and stealing whatever remains of your stuff. He says, likewise, everything else, that our doings in Ukraine are a fight for freedom, that white supremacy lurks just out of sight, getting ready to pounce on the marginalized who are actually running things and doing it very badly, that Joe Biden turned around the economy, that voting rights equals non-citizens getting to vote, that election fraud is a big lie, and that the J6 riot over it was an insurrection. Oh, and that the COVID vaccines were safe and effective. Now, again, this is not to tell you, boy, you are sure stupid if you bought into this. A lot of people did, because it was an almost endless onslaught day after day being beamed at you. And the people who were able to successfully break that mind meld and see through it, they were few and far between. That doesn't mean they're better than you. It just means that they opted out of the narrative sooner. You can still save your dignity, and you can still salvage whatever pride you have left. Just learn from the mistake and don't make the same mistake again. All right, let's bring it a little bit closer to home. Let's give you a couple of examples of what this looks like in your local media. Here we have a headline. This is from idahopress.com. This is from a couple of days ago. Meridian senator faces IFF-backed opponent in Republican primary. Now, this is subtle, but it's also a falsehood, because the Idaho Freedom Foundation cannot and does not endorse candidates. They can't. It's absolutely against the operating rules of the kind of organization they are. Now, there is a wing that they work with called the Idaho Freedom Action, which does do lobbying and which can actually advocate for candidates. But the Idaho Freedom Foundation cannot. But listen to a couple of excerpts from this story here. Laura Guaido is just straining credulity to try to get us to believe this. An incumbent senator from Meridian, whom she describes in the most glowing terms possible, because he fits her, her echo chamber narrative, will face an Idaho Freedom Foundation backed opponent. Not endorsed, but she's saying it's backed. She's not, this opponent is not backed by the Idaho Freedom Foundation, but could be backed by Idaho Freedom Action. And there is a difference. But this is not something most people are going to likely do their homework to figure out. This is in the primary race for District 21, Idaho Senate. Now, the article goes on to tell us the advocacy arm of the IFF, she never actually names it, Idaho Freedom Action. Again, it's a totally separate organization, but it is an ultra-conservative policy organization that's supposed to put the fear in you so you can't believe anything they say. Endorsed candidate Bourne and cited Senator Bernst's vote on HB 71 as a reason to oppose the incumbent. This was on the providing, so-called gender-affirming care to minors. Berndt, for some reason, has decided that's the hill he's going to die on, and so he absolutely has voted in favor with the Alphabet Gang on this. Now, there was another query here about the IFF indicated Berndt voted to support 2023 legislation that would have provided a restricted driver's license to undocumented immigrants, but Berndt never voted on this bill and doesn't sit on the committee that it went through. Well, I'll tell you what, there's a very handy way that you can keep track of what he actually did do, and that is through the Idaho Freedom Foundation's Freedom Index. By the way, this is not the first time that complaints have been lodged against Idaho Freedom Foundation of breaking nonprofit rules. The IRS, according to this 2021 article, which the Biden administration says has been understaffed, hasn't said whether it's investigating, but there are journalists who wish that they would and people who wish that they would, because they're trying to, basically sick the government dogs on the Idaho Freedom Foundation. So what does the Freedom Foundation advocate for? Well, they advocate for conservative policies, but not for specific candidates. Now, having said that, let me show you where some people might get the impression, well, they are advocating for candidates, okay? Because this is part of the Freedom Index. Here's the Idaho Freedom Index. Here's an all-star Senator Phil Hart. Look at that, A+ on the Freedom Index score, A- on the Spending Index score. That's not an endorsement, though. That is just like this person adhered to this 12-point matrix of the Idaho Freedom Foundation's Freedom Index in upholding limited government responsibility for spending, accountability and so forth. But it's not the same thing as therefore we endorse him. Now, people who are into freedom, who are into responsible government, and especially into fiscal accountability, might take that as a good sign that, Phil Hart seems like a guy who actually walks the walk, doesn't just talk the talk. But here's how you can know for yourself. And again, you don't need someone telling you this is who you need to vote for. just get yourself a copy of the Idaho Freedom Index. It's out. All you have to do is go to idahofreedom.org, request it. They're going to ask you for an email, and they can either send it to you by email. You can get a hard copy if you want. Look at how these elected representatives voted. That's not the same thing as endorsing them. And yes, some of them do look bad, especially if you're approaching this from a principled standpoint, and you know the difference between limited government and irresponsible government, and people spending like drunken sailors versus those who are being very careful and very accountable with the money of the taxpayers. I don't know why that's called lobbying. That's called endorsing, but no, that's called helping the voters do their homework so they can see who is actually, by their actions, upholding principles of freedom and who isn't. You've heard the saying before that the truth hurts. Well, it does if you're on the wrong side of the truth. And those who portray themselves as I'm a common sense conservative, but who vote like a hardcore Democratic liberal or progressive, well, the truth shows them to be not quite all that they pretend to be. So again, it comes back to you. Either you control your mind or someone else will. That's a lot smarter approach than just simply telling you, hey, vote for this person because I said so. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy.